Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Adrienne Hill. Adrienne, how are you doing today?
I am doing extremely well. Thank you for asking. Very busy, but...
I can imagine. I'm in Boston. You're up in Calgary.
Yes.
I've been to Winnipeg once. I took the train from Toronto to Vancouver, that overnight 3-day trip.
Yes.
And it stopped in Winnipeg. I think it must have been 2 a.m, but I wanted to get out anyway. It was 40 below. It was mid-February. I just wanted to get out and experience it.
That's amazing. Not many people have experienced that. Did your eyelashes freeze?
It was difficult to breathe, actually.
Yeah.
So you wanted to breathe slowly. I don't think my eyelashes froze, and the other weird thing about the train is there were security issues, so I didn't realize that you couldn't just get off and get back on. If you're off, you have to stay off until they are ready to move again, and then they reboard you. So you can either stay on or get off, but nothing in between. My mistake.
Did you have a nice warm coat at least?
I was fine. So.
Oh, that's good.
All right. Anyway, we'll get to the topic at hand. I do have a proper bio on you. I shall introduce you properly at this point. Adrienne is a former high school mathematics teacher who currently dedicates her time to various roles and interests. A skeptical activist, she serves as a board member for the nonprofit organization About Time. Additionally, she holds positions as a board member, presenter, and educational consultant for the Tourette OCD Alberta Network, and Adrienne actively contributes as an editor for Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia. She also reports for the Skeptic Zone podcast, writes for Skeptical Inquirer magazine in the United States, and also Australia's The Skeptic magazine. And she co-chairs the Western Canadian Reason Conference, Week in Reason, which is held annually each May in Calgary, Canada. Her website is zonegiggler.ca. Welcome once again, and full disclosure, Adrienne and I have met before on Zoom at some trivia game events, and we met for the first time, I think, in person at SciCon 2022, which is the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry Conference. And
that's correct.
We'll soon see each other again at SciCon 2024. Another 3 amazing days of speakers and workshops. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Cox, Rena Raphael. So many. I mean, is there anyone specific? It's hard to pick one that you really want to see, so I don't.
Well, I'm really looking forward to Brian Cox because I've been a fan of his for a very long time. Neil deGrasse Tyson spoke in 2022, and I thought it was one of the best keynote speeches I've ever seen. So I'm really looking forward to seeing him again. And I would be remiss to not mention Richard Saunders is going to be there, my producer, etc., for the Skeptic Zone podcast. And he will be working with Kenny Biddle on the Thursday morning workshop, doing a workshop about just, the tricks of the trade for pseudoscience, ghost hunting, spoon bending, that kind of thing. So I'm really looking forward to that. I've seen Richard at work. I've seen Kenny at work. I'm really excited about that.
All right. I'll see you there. Maybe we can hang out. I usually hibernate when I'm not at the conference. Unlike, so maybe I'll do something this year. I don't know. All right. Let's talk about you. So first, you are a skeptical activist. So what does that mean?
Well, I like to think of it as consumer advocacy, because when we are investigating something, looking into good, reliable sources, for example, with my Wikipedia editing, we're looking for the scientific approach, and we are trying to protect people from the pseudoscience that they're falling for, such as alternative medicine, such as ghosts. And people will say, well, what's the harm? It's not doing any harm. So what if it's the placebo effect, etc.? Well, the simplest one is it's their wallet that's being affected. And a more sinister one would be not getting the appropriate treatment for medical things. For ghosts, Ben Radford and Joe Nickel and Kenny Biddle have all reported people moving out of their homes because they think their house is haunted, and a psychic will come in, a psychic medium, and say, yes, there's a curse here or there's something going on. This is harmful. And I think that it's really important to get the proper, well-sourced information out there to people. And that's my biggest activism, I think, is Wikipedia, because there's a lot of views on Wikipedia. A lot of people look at it. And we actually keep stats for that through the Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia.
What are you up to, like 15 million or 150 million views or some?
I'm a very slow editor, very methodical. Like, for example, the Winchester Mystery House, which we will talk about more. It took me 2 years to really complete that. That was a lot of reading books, and I have to kind of think about it. And I'm not a writer. I'm a mathematician. I went to university. I have a math degree, and so it was very different for me to have to learn to write. So it's been a slow process for me, but I published or rewrote the Winchester Mystery House page in 2022. It's almost been 2 years, and it's basically at 1 million views in that 2 years. So it usually gets between 30,000 and 50,000 views per month, which is a lot better than I get on my social media, I'll tell you that. So I think I am having an impact for sure.
Well, speaking of the Sallie Winchester house, you recently had the Skeptical Inquirer cover article for your writing on that, and you had the article was Sallie Winchester and the Mystery House. I thought it was great, specifically because it exposed how some true events can morph into folklore, and then even later into myth. And I take the academic view of folklore and myth, that folklore is usually it's some possible events or maybe a person, and there are tales that become larger than life. But myths involve the paranormal and supernatural. So like Johnny Appleseed was a real person who became a folk legend, same for Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and that stuff. But they didn't amalgamate into supernatural events. But with Sallie Winchester, we've got it all, right? So
we've got everything.
We got a real person who did some really interesting things for her time period. So that takes on this larger-than-life aspect, and for some reason that wasn't good enough, and then it gets into some paranormal features. Is that a fair short synopsis?
I think that's very fair. Yeah,
okay,
for sure. It does include everything.
So now tell me the popular before you started writing, give me a brief popular version of Sallie Winchester and the house, and then we'll dig into your article.
Yeah. You want the spiritual version first? Is that what you're wanting, or do you want her more true story first?
Well, that's an interesting point. Let's get the folklore myth first, because that's probably what people. It's been featured. Her house has been featured on some of these ghost shows, right?
Many of them.
Okay, many of them. So people are probably more familiar with that. So let's start with the folkloric myth paranormal part.
Okay. So she married William Wirt Winchester, who is the heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. And they had a baby, a little girl, and she died a month later. And shortly after that, Sarah's lost her mother, her father-in-law, and her beloved husband. And she was so distraught that she went to a psychic medium.
Wait, can I stop you for a second? So you just called her Sarah, so she has a different name as well? So people know, they may only know her as, so let's clear that up.
So she was called, by the Mystery House and the lore, she is called Sarah all the time, Sarah Winchester. And her birth certificate is actually Sarah Lockwood Purdie, which is her maiden name, and then she became Sarah Lockwood Winchester. And the story behind the real name that she was called all her life is that her paternal grandmother died shortly after Sarah Winchester was born. And I guess it was Sarah Purdie at the time. And her parents always called her Sallie. All her friends and family called her Sallie all her life. And she signed her correspondence Sallie.
Oh, okay.
So that is actually her legal name was Sarah, but that's not what she was known as when she was alive.
Okay, so I interrupted you at she lost her husband. So go through, she lost her husband, or her daughter first, sorry.
Her daughter, her mother, her father-in-law, and her husband, all within a short time period. And she was so distraught that she went to a psychic medium. Now, when she was alive, it was just a generic psychic medium, but in the 1960s, it turned into Adam Coons was the specific psychic medium that she went to. And the psychic medium apparently told her that the reason all these deaths occurred was because she was cursed by the ghosts of all the people that had died from the Winchester repeating rifle. And so she was feeling really guilty about all these deaths. And this medium told her that she needed to build a house that would house all the dead spirits of the people who had been killed by the Winchester rifles. And that as long as she kept building, she would stay alive. She wouldn't die, but she had to keep building, otherwise she would perish. And she was told to go west, go to California. So she went to California, bought a house, and then she started building. And she built this house from 1886 until the day she died in 1922. And she had workers constructing a maze of a house 24 hours a day, no breaks. And she was so afraid of these spirits that she built a crazy maze to try to confuse them. That's one part of the lore. The other part is she held seances every night and rang a bell to bring them in, and she would consult with them as to how to construct the house the following day. So sometimes they're evil spirits trying to track her down, sometimes they're benevolent and trying to help her build her house to house them. She also
wait a second. I got to stop you. So I guess that glossed over me. So at night, so I think for this part, I'm going to have to scroll something that says folklore alert because right now you're just telling the popular version. I want to make that clear.
Yes.
This is what the popular version is.
Correct.
So in the popular version, she actually had a bell she would ring and had continuing evening conversation with various spirits.
Apparently, yes.
Okay, so that's even beyond what, like psychic mediums, it's always like, oh, I think I'm getting this, I think I'm getting that. But there's some folklore that she sat down and had conversations.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, she held it, and she held these seances by herself, which is a little ludicrous considering a seance is actually a social gathering. That was part of the culture of the time. It was part of the spiritualist movement. You know, she was alive at the height of the spiritualist movement. And so but you know, they thought she was odd and crazy and held these lonely seances all by herself. And she would hold them in the seance room, which is called the Blue Room. And she had 13 hooks with 13 robes, and she would put on one of these robes to talk to her spirits. And another, so go ahead. You want to?
No, I'm just stunned at all this detail. Go on.
Oh yeah, I've read a lot of it. Oh, trust me. And the more I read about this and then the correction, I started to get really angry actually. And I think that's part of the reason I took as much time as I did. I did want to try and get it as right as possible. You know, I didn't want to.
I will interrupt now and say I think you've laid a lot out. So let's go.
Yeah. Oh, and there's even more, but that's good.
That's the folklore of the house. All these seances, the never-ending construction. Well, let's go through some of those, right? You just told me the origin. So she is a real person. She suffered great tragedy, not unlike many people of that time. Everything in the world wanted to kill you. Well, actually, everything in the world still kind of wants to kill you, but we've gotten better at trying to
exactly
keep it at bay.
Yep.
I think as you write in your article, now it's time to separate the fancy from fact. You laid so much out there. Let's see if we may miss something, but let's try not to. So let's just start with the first thing. She suffered all these great tragedies, and then she went to a psychic medium.
Well, first of all, I want to correct those great tragedies, because in the lore, they all happened at once. When in reality, they lost their daughter, and it was 15 years later that her husband died. So there's actually quite a gap where they were, where they were together, they did things together, they traveled together, they had a good life together. They built a home in New Haven together with architects, and that's where her love of architecture started. And when she moved, or when she supposedly, well, there's no evidence actually that she ever visited a psychic medium. Is it possible? Sure, because for her status, women at that time did have a tendency to believe in in the spiritualist movement and were heavily involved in it. So is it likely she at some point in her life went to a psychic medium and maybe attended a seance with somebody? Sure. However, there's no evidence that she ever believed it, and there's no evidence that she continued to do it or did so after the deaths of her family. There's a lot of correspondence that they have between her and her lawyers and between the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, which she was a board member of until the day she died. And her staff and friends and family all said she was not superstitious at all, and she was very level-headed. So there's no evidence. Could she have gone? Sure. But highly unlikely.
Let me highlight something here, though, because the way the story is told, that's her visiting this medium who gives her all this advice and tells her what to do. That's the foundation for everything. Without that story, there's no house, there's no constant construction, there's no rooms leading to nowhere. So if that's not true, where, it's kind of on flimsy, shaky ground now.
It is, very much so. And I found an old article, I believe it was 1911, in a local paper in the San Jose area. And it was really interesting because the lore turned into she had to keep building the Winchester Mystery House, otherwise she would die. But actually, in that paper, it was she had to build a house a year in the area or she would die. So you can see how the lore and the story and the myth has really changed over time.
And that is a characteristic of, that is a characteristic of folklore, right? It's these variants that happen. There's never one story. If you look far enough, there are always these variants that are added to or subtracted from, and it depends on what year it was written or who's telling the story.
Yeah. And whether or not somebody's trying to profit off it.
Oh, didn't think of that one. Regardless of the medium, somehow she does move to California and she builds a house. All right, so...
Yeah, well, I think there's good reasons for her moving, to be honest, because she had visited California with her husband. They went to San Francisco on business, and she would go with them, and she really liked San Francisco. She suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis, and her doctor most likely said, you need to go to a drier climate. That was a very common thing to recommend. And there was a lot of brochures telling people to move to the California dream at the time. So it was really a trend to move to California. Property was cheap. They were advertising you could, create a farm and be self-sustaining. And she had a very successful time in California buying properties. And the Winchester, which was actually called Yenatavilla, after a Spanish place that her and her husband had visited when they were traveling, and she loved it so much she named this place after it. And she had a successful farm. It produced money for her. Like, it was a thriving farm, and that was the promise to move there. So there were good reasons to move.
So separate from visiting a medium, there were just the popular zeitgeist, I guess I'll call it, the spirit of the time. Oh, spirit of the times. There were a lot of reasons to move that she may have been exposed. We can't say any specific thing, but there's a lot of good evidence that people were just doing that at the time.
Yeah.
When we get to she moves to California to build the house, I guess there's two things that come up. There's the never-ending construction, and then there's also the haphazard construction. You've probably got to tell those two together. I'm not sure. You can separate them if you want. So what's this about? So the medium says, well, the folklore becomes, or the mythological part becomes, a medium tells her you can never end construction. But how does there's part of that story that's true, right? So what's the true part of never-ending construction?
The true part is that she did build on that home for 20 years. But they always say from 1886 to 1922, when in fact the construction stopped in 1906 because of a very famous event called the San Francisco earthquake. It was she had a 7-story tower as well as rooms up to 5 stories at the time. And after the earthquake, all the upper stories crumbled down, and she had 2 stories left. So the stairs to nowhere, the doors that open to two-story drops. Well, that's now explained because the building collapsed. And she was not in good health by that time. And all she had done was she cleared the rubble. She boarded things up to make it safe. And so some people could still stay there. There were still rooms, but it was a lot smaller than it ever was. At its peak, she built 500 rooms approximately. It was a huge, huge home. And now it's about 160. So and that's because of the earthquake. The earthquake demolished a good portion of, and I think she was devastated. And the other thing that people forget is she had multiple properties in the area. And as is typical of her class, she would go from one property to the next property and stay for a couple months at each property and rotate around. And she rented a lot of them out and made income from them. And she also brought all her family. She was a very generous lady. And she paid for all their houses and gave them a monthly income so that they could stay and come out to the coast with her. So she brought her family and her nieces and nephews, and she was very close to some of them. And so she was a lovely lady. And with regards to the 24 hours, no. She allowed her workers to sleep. And I couldn't imagine having construction if you're staying in the house. That would be crazy. No, she let them sleep. And there were months at a time where construction would stop, even in that 20 years between when she started the construction and when the earthquake happened. For example, there was an expo in San Francisco, and she gave her full staff, everybody, the week off, and they all went to the expo together. And I'm sure she paid for it. I don't know for sure. I don't remember, but and the staff loved her because they gave them time off, and she was generous. They all lived on her properties. She fed them. She looked after her staff, and then she also would sometimes stop construction just because she wasn't well. And she said, I need a couple months break. I can't do this anymore. I just need a break. The other thing she would do would be, well, we can't plaster right now because the weather's not good. It's just like it happens now, right?
So mundane reasons.
Mundane reasons to stop, exactly. There is none of this continuous construction for 24 hours a day until 1922. No, that's fiction.
Let me point out a couple of things, or phrase them as statements, but maybe questions as well. She was a responsible homeowner after a disaster and boarded it up for safety reasons. And somehow I'm not sure it's used against her, but it becomes part of the folklore. So, and then she sounds like a real social pioneer in the sense of treating her staff well. That's something you don't really hear about that much back then, correct. The separation of the classes. It didn't seem, so she's actually a really responsible, forward-looking person from what you've just described. And then the third thing I have to point out is right at the top of that, you said, they always say. I have to say, when anybody says they always say, who do you mean they? I'm not letting you get away with that.
Thank you so much. Well, the Winchester Mystery House tours, the souvenir books, almost every article, if you Google Winchester Mystery House, you're going to come up with a whole bunch of articles that say all this. And I've even found it on some fairly reputable, like New York Times. I mean, you have to go back, right? But they're everywhere. So it really is almost like a collective they. It just became part of the ingrained culture. It became a movie, Winchester with Helen Mirren, which was terrible, but that's okay. Well, forgive her that one bad movie. But yeah, it's become ingrained. So it was that's one of the reasons I had to go to historians and books and not, most of my Wikipedia stuff, I just go find a bunch of good articles, maybe science-based medicine, McGill Office of Science and Society. I can go to online things and just find it really quickly, and they're not really long, and I just, can get an article out fairly quickly. This one took a long time because I had to go to historians and folklorists and read books. So it was a little more work than a normal Wikipedia page, for sure. You
did go visit the house as well, in addition to all this research.
Yes.
And by what I mean by, in this case of doing your own research, it means you're looking at a lot of other writing of other people and trying to get to the truth. So it's that type of research as opposed to everything's feet on the ground. But you did do some actual boots on the ground. I guess that's the term. Boots on the ground research.
Boots on the ground research.
You went to the house and you participated in the tour. So
2 tours.
2 tours. Wow. So when we're talking about this haphazard construction and doors that go nowhere, staircases that lead nowhere, did you actually see some of that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. They're very quick to point all of that out. And it was very interesting because our tour guide, we went on a spirit tour, which took us to a lot of the unfinished. Most of the house is unfinished because of, I think the earthquake was destroyed and it's kind of shambles. It's dark, it's eerie. So of course the spirit tour was in that part of the house. And then they have the house tour. And the girl that gave us the house tour, I thought she was quite lovely. And she had a little twinkle in her eye. And so she would say some of the story, the myth, and, you know, she said, it could be this, but she would sometimes give a more rational explanation. Other times she wouldn't. For example, when she showed us the stair to nowhere, which is right to a boarded up roof, you know, you go up the stairs and then it's a roof. That's it. She says, isn't this odd? And I said, well, isn't that because of the earthquake? And she went, yep. So if you ask, but apparently not all the tour guides are like that, because Susan Gerbeck, she went again just a couple months ago, and there was none of that sort of truthfulness. It was all the spooky lore. So it really depends on who you get. And because we asked the question both times, like Susan asked it this time and I asked it last, or not me, another person asked it. So when you do the tours, are you given a script, or can you kind of do your own thing? Like, well, how does this work? They said, we're given a basic script, and then we can look into more and add more that we want to do. So there is some element of freedom. So if they had read Mary Jo Ignolfo's book, which is one of my primary sources that I use, who is a historian from California, and if they read that, they would be aware of these alternative ideas. And so anytime this girl was questioned about things, like there's a claim that Sarah Winchester was in the earthquake trapped in her room and she screamed for hours before she was rescued. And Mary Jo Ignolfo says it is possible, but there's correspondence from her 3 days before the earthquake from her home in Atherton to her lawyer. And so her guess was that's where she was, but we can't be sure. And there's no correspondence after the fact that goes, oh my God, I was trapped, you know, to her family, right? Which you would think if you were trapped and you were that distressed and traumatized, there'd be something. And she did make a generous donation to the Red Cross anonymously, which she always did. But, you know, that was her way of helping. But yeah, there's no real evidence that she was trapped. It's possible, but we don't really know. And so when we pushed that with this girl, she says, yeah, we don't really know. So she was truthful. It was good. It was nice.
When you say she made a donation to the Red Cross, but it was anonymous, how does that work out? So how do you know that she did that?
That's a really good question. They didn't find out how generous she was until after she died. And
this is her family, now? Her family didn't find out?
Nobody found out.
Oh, okay.
The only person that knew, so this is again a collective they. Thank you for catching me on that. And so her lawyer knew, because it was the lawyer who would always make the donations. And after she died, it all came out because the lawyer had all these receipts showing what she had done. And she was thought of as being very miserly by her neighbors because she attended some fundraising events when she first moved there and her health was better, but as her health got worse, she just didn't do that anymore, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you're not feeling well, you're not going to go to these big social events. But she would almost always make donations to causes she felt were important, including to I think it was a Catholic church in the area, and animal rights. Her and her sister were really big into. And you know, so she was a very good donor. She was very philanthropic. She was essentially responsible for funding the tuberculosis ward that eventually became part of the Yale University. And that was millions of dollars that she sent there. And eventually they did find out, because one of the criteria for the donations was that it was to be named after her husband, Will Wirt Winchester.
Wow. That's an amazing story in and of itself.
Yeah.
And that is well documented, as you've just laid out.
That is very well documented, that she was very philanthropic. There's extensive records that have been kept. All her letters to her lawyer, apparently, or most of the letters to her lawyer. The lawyer was very good at keeping records of everything, and that's all been archived. And I believe it's at Stanford as well as in San Jose. So everything was available to Mary Jo Ignoffo.
You'd think that would be something they would want to point out at the house and at least have copies of the archives in a room there. So, let's look at all this stuff too. But that's not mentioned during the tours?
No.
Wow, that's something you would really want to trumpet. That doesn't make any sense. Very odd.
They do say was philanthropic. They do say that she was very good to her employees. In fact, her gardener, who was Japanese, she hired a lot of people who were from out of the country. And part of the reason could have been, and this is just speculation, because the trend at that time was that they were paid less, and she paid the going rate. So there's some lore out there that she paid double or triple. According to Mary Jo Ignoffo, from what I remember, and memory can be fickle, so excuse me if I'm wrong, but apparently she paid the going rate, but the difference with her was how she treated everybody. She kept them employed even through the Depression of the 1890s. And that was a big part of her construction and why it carried on, I think, is she wanted to keep these people employed. And there's also a little bit of a rumor that Mary Jo Ignoffo talks about, because of the letters that she's read to her family that are still available to her, that originally she wanted to build a huge house so she could house the family, all the family and their spouses and children that came with her, so they could all live in one big grand house. But then she started realizing she didn't really want them to live there.
Yeah, right. I mean, that does not sound like a good idea to me. I don't know. I mean, it's what a romantic idea, but let's just forget that.
Yeah, so she bought them their houses elsewhere, and they're very different. Like, especially her sister Belle was very outgoing, and she got arrested, and she was just out there. So maybe she kind of changed her mind when, that's supposition, but, it does give a good reason. I'll just keep building and employ these people through this very difficult time. And I still am, she was learning. She loved architecture. She subscribed to architectural magazines. So she loved the process of building and then tearing down, and she had the money and the wherewithal to do it. So she was cool. Oh, and I lost track. The gardener, who is Japanese, their granddaughter, when the granddaughter was born, named the girl after Sarah Winchester. Now, how many employees do you know that named their kid or grandkid after their employer? Not many. So she must have been a pretty wonderful person.
It's interesting what you speak about, that when they do talk about the people that run the house, that have a financial interest in it, or whoever they may be, writing these brochures and pamphlets and running house tours, it's used to say, she did it all because she was guilty because of all the people that died from the Winchester rifles. When there's no evidence of that. But that's how it's used, it seems like, from what you were saying earlier in the discussion. It's used against, not against her, but...
It is. Well, it's trying to find a reason for her odd behavior. Her behavior for the times was odd.
Progressive.
Progressive, exactly. She was a woman who was the main contractor for a house. It was unheard of, right? She's building her own house. And what's really interesting, too, is that big, rambling, weird houses were kind of in vogue at the time, too. So there are other ones that are just like it, not with the stairs to nowhere because they didn't have an earthquake, but, they're out there. And I saw a picture of Mary Chenoweth's house, which is also in the San Jose area. She was a peer of Sarah Winchester's, and they feature her on the tour. Mary Chenoweth is a well-known spiritualist. She was really into it. She called herself a mystic and a medium. She founded a church. And it was kind of like, and this is how it was presented in the house. Well, they must have known each other. One's a spiritualist, therefore the other must be a spiritualist. It was kind of an odd thing. And her house, I saw pictures of her house, Chenoweth's house. It looked very similar to what the Winchester Mystery House was. It burned down, so it's no longer around. But the pictures of her house, I thought when I first saw it was the Winchester Mystery House. So the construction and the design was not unusual for the time. What was unusual, it was a woman who was doing it.
All right, let me ask us something very specific that was in your article. I guess it's featured on the tour and in the literature, the propaganda, I don't know what to call it. All these instances of 13 everywhere, which seems like a more modern thing anyway. So 13 steps, 13 bathrooms, 13 or candles, chandeliers with 13 candles, 13 trees and so on. So give me a little story versus truth there. First of all, you went to the house. So is everything just 13 all the time?
Oh, God, no. Talk about looking for something to try to fit. What do they call that? Anomaly hunting or something like that? Is that the right term?
I think so.
So, yeah. So because I was aware of this, I paid particular attention to the 13s, particularly the stairs, because they really go on and on about how there's, multiple staircases with 13. And one of the ones that they pointed out, there was 13 stairs. The other one, it was 13 stairs down to a landing you had to turn down, but you had to go down one more stair to get to the level. So isn't that 14? But I guess if you want to just stay on the landing, it's 13 stairs. And it is a maze of a house. It's crazy. It's so fun. It's beautiful. The craftsmanship is stunning. And it winds and twists and goes all over the place and is quite confusing. And there were 7 steps, there were 5 steps, there were 40 steps, there were 11 steps, you know what I'm saying? There was one that we went on that was 13.
Just one out of,
counted.
And the house has 160 rooms. I can't imagine how many staircases.
And it does, and sometimes it only goes like up half a landing kind of thing. It's a very, she's like, oh, I'm going to put this here, and oh, but we're going to need some steps, so I guess we better put our 4 or 5 steps in. The coat hooks was an interesting one because we were in another room they were talking about, and I noticed, hey, there's a little alcove over there. There's 5 hooks there. She didn't mention those. We go into the next room. Oh, there's the 13 hooks. According to a carpenter who worked there for the Mystery House, he said it was all added after the fact.
Oh, and to make it 13?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. And it's interesting because I was teaching to a class at Grant MacEwan University in Edmonton on Friday and showing them what it said in the brochure. So when we went in the bathroom, they said this was the 13th bathroom to be constructed. And I'm like, okay, maybe, but how do you know that? Could be. How do you know this is the 13th bathroom? Could be the 2nd bathroom. Who knows?
And what's the difference? I mean, wherever we go, we have to take, to get to 14 steps, you have to take 13. If I go to the bathroom from here, at some point I'm going to take a 13th step. What's the big deal? So it's the 13th step I took. Who cares?
Exactly. And there were 13 windows in I think it was the seance room. I may have the rooms mixed up. It made no sense. They were just adding to the nonsensical nature of this. It was a very small room. And also the seance room, did I say this before? Forgive me if I did, that it was actually the gardener's bedroom in the records. So it was not a seance room, it was the gardener's bedroom. And I think before that it was an office for, some of her staff, and it was a different bedroom, but it was never a seance room, according to the records.
Ah, that's the cover story they want you to believe now.
That's right. They being Mary Jo Ignapo, Joe Nickel, Owen Davies, Colin Dickies. Yeah, so go on. Yeah. All the people who have written.
Let me sum that up, actually. I'm not going to sum it up, but let me go a little bit deeper into this for the times, and even now maybe we'll get to. But talk to me about the ascribing of evil to women. So I don't know if it's evil, but I'm not going to call it evil in her case. But let's talk about the ascribing of the supernatural to women, single women specifically. So in your investigation, I mean, is there anything that led you to think that may have played any part? So, and let me explain. So when I talk about ascribing evil to women, it's blaming a drought. or loss of crops or natural disaster or a child that goes missing. You know, all those kinds of things get blamed on this odd old woman that lives at the edge of town. That's the that's a stereotypical image. But I think people, if you look back through history, actually you don't even have to look through history. It still happens in other parts of the world today, ascribing terrible things to witches in India or Pakistan or Africa and even in South America. So this is kind of a mild ascribing of evil in her case. But do you think just being a single woman of the time that was working on her own and doing all these things, do you think that played any part in it? Does that question make any sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, if I don't recall finding anything that said she caused negative things to happen. Okay. I didn't find anything like that. However, I did find people trying to take advantage of her, men trying to take advantage of her because I think they thought she was crazy because she was somewhat reclusive, because she had bad health, missing teeth. I think she was probably somewhat self-conscious. That's me projecting. You know, I think we would all be, but I think it was mostly her health. She just had difficulty walking. You know, those 40 stairs that I was talking about, they're only like 2 inches tall, so she could actually get up to the second level. So it was quite ingenious to be able to get her to walk up to the next level without too much pain. So there's actually, again, a reason for this craziness that's going on that's pretty dull. But these men did try to take advantage of her, and one of them was wanting to run for county assessor. And so he was going around in his speeches saying that Winchester only was assessed $800 and I will make sure that doesn't help. Well, she got pissed with this because she was assessed $80,000 for her multiple properties in the area. And so she wrote a letter, an open letter to the newspapers, which did publish it, saying what a liar he was and that he was picking on her because she was a widow, a woman who couldn't vote. And he lost. So I call that badass Sallie.
Wow.
I think she's pretty wonderful. And another guy rented from her farm, and he was also one of her contractors who was going to build a canal. This is after the Winchester house stopped being built. She had another project after the earthquake for the, it's an area of San Francisco, and I just can't remember the neighborhood name. And she was going to build a canal system, and she had the plans drawn up, and the construction was started. And this canal system was for the wealthy to be able to go from the East Coast. The Panama Canal was about to open. And so they would go through the Panama Canal and come up to San Francisco. And she was selling it as a tourist thing. Then these rich people could dock here at these lovely houses. And so this guy who was one of the contractors started stealing her sand and gravel off of her property, didn't pay his rent for the farm that he was living on, and she sued him, and she successfully sued him. A woman sued a man. And there's sort of a rumor that in this area, all the sidewalks are a result of Sarah Winchester's stolen sand. There were big ditches in her properties that were left because of this guy stealing this stuff from her properties.
Wow, that's amazing. So when she was taken advantage of, so she wasn't described motivation, she actually, it's another unusual thing about her, she fought back. And she fought the law she fought the law and she won in this case.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, so because when I was speaking
and she was not healthy at that time, right? This is a woman who's getting up there, and she was probably in her 70s at that time with severe rheumatoid arthritis. You could tell she was still thinking very clearly.
I mentioned the ascribing of evil to others. I guess I should say it can take on a milder form because even here in the U.S., for some reason, childless cat ladies are now being blamed for wanting to take over and make the country miserable. It's a version of blaming single women. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's a judgment. And I think that's what happened with Sallie, is because she kind of kept to herself, her family and friends, because she was building this big house for 20 years, which was unusual. Usually it didn't take that long. Because of these things, people made stuff up. Because if she doesn't come forward, she would not come forward and talk to the press. She just refused. So that, I think, built into it. People make things up when they don't know, the person doesn't come forward. They make guesses. I think we see that all the time, as you say, in today's society. And that's, I think, what happened to her.
Let's talk a little bit about just writing for Wikipedia, because you updated the Sallie Winchester page, but you ran into a bit of trouble updating it. Just talk about that. What's that? How does, just give me a brief idea of how Wikipedia works, as briefly as you can.
Yeah, that could be a whole hour on itself for sure. So briefly, what you have to do is you have to have good secondary sources, not primary sources. So people have already done the research and looked at things and then written about it, or they have to be historians. It has to be something that's valid. Like the souvenir guide to the Winchester Mystery House would not be considered a good, reliable source unless you're pointing out what they're saying. You know what I'm saying? So they're saying this comes from the guide. And then so I create it in a sandbox. I create all my articles, and when it's ready to publish, I wipe out the old one and I go onto a talk page and say, this is what I'm doing, because it's, and there are tags on these, right? What a tag is usually it's missing citations. The citations are not good. So there's a reason for a tag, and they were tagged as being poor articles. So I said, I'm fixing it, and here it is. And then an admin comes in, or a senior editor that are assigned to checking new articles or big revisions, and they okay it. So there is a process, and all of mine have made it through so far. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes they say, no, this is not a notable, or it's not good enough, or whatever, and they'll just nix it. But I've been fortunate. I've done 11 articles now, and all of them have stuck. And the Winchester Mystery House staff were not happy, as others. I'm sure there's other people as well. So what happened shortly after my Winchester Mystery House publication, which was the first one I did, is they tried to revert it back to the old, but they didn't know how to do it. So they just kind of copied and pasted from a different page that was already on the internet, that had already plagiarized Wikipedia, and they didn't resource it or anything. So it was a mess. And that this person kept reverting. So what happened is an admin would come in, revert back to my version. This person would come in, delete everything. And this is what they call editing wars. If that happens 3 times, it's an edit war, and then they're blocked. And 3 months later, somebody came in and tried to start doing it again. This time they knew a little bit more, and they went on what's called the top pages. There's a little button on the top corner on the left. Anybody can look at it. And there's discussion. So this person said, I am an employee of the Winchester Mystery House, and this is full of Mary Agnofo's work. She never once came to the house to look at our documents. And so she's a liar, and basically call her a liar. And I stay out of it. Let the Wikipedia process work, and it did. And they kept reverting her edits. And then she said, well, in that case, just do the history, take all the ghost stuff out of it. Just do the history. Because they want to be able to still perpetuate it. They don't want it countered, and it's countered on the page. And I take their stuff, the lore that's in their book, and I referenced it, and then I counter it with Joe Nickel and Mary Agnofo and all these other people, Brian Dunning. And, so my stuff stuck, and they were not happy. And recently there was one that someone came in and changed the 13 things and said, no, this was all true. No, it got reverted right away. Same thing with the Sarah Winchester page, or Sallie Winchester. Same thing happened. They weren't happy with it, and there was one point, one of the big legends that we didn't talk about was her inheritance. She did have a lot of money. There's no doubt about it. But they have hyperbolized that to stupid proportions, because just recently somebody said that she had a salary of $500 million when she was alive. It's like, come on. Where does that even come from?
What's the point?
So yeah, I don't know.
Anything else you want to talk about, Sallie Winchester? We've covered it I think we've done a good job here. Your article is going to be linked below. Now, if people don't want to wait for, they can also go right to the Wikipedia page and see everything that we're speaking of here. By the way, if you go to Wikipedia, it's not going to say Adrienne Hill there. That's not the way it works. But if you go to the Skeptical Inquirer article, it will say Adrienne Hill. So
that's right.
Is there anything I missed here? You mentioned her salary, so I'm glad you got that out. Is there anything Is there anything else?
There's so many things we could talk about. I guess one of the fun things that I think is really interesting is at the time in the early 1900s, Arks became fashionable. And they called them Arks.
Okay.
It's essentially a big houseboat, a
Oh,
huge
okay.
houseboat. And she had one. And that's actually where she lived after the earthquake, because all of her homes sustained damage to greater or lesser degree. But her houseboat was fine because it was on water. So that's where she lived while she fixed up her Atherton home to live in. And that's the home she actually lived in until she died, from my understanding. And that's where she lived when she boarded up the Winchester Mystery House. So I think that's kind of a fun piece of information I like to share that's a little different. But I'm also really glad that I got to talk about her badassery, because that's the part that didn't make the article. They're just, I read a book, right? You have to summarize this into little bits, but I really admire this woman. And I think because she was a woman, she was vilified. Because she was a strong woman, she was vilified. And I think that it's important to celebrate her and to celebrate what she really was, and to be amazed. She was really ahead of her time. And I think that's pretty special.
We've briefly touched on it here. The article is linked below. You can go to Wikipedia and read about it as well. There's so much more to it. Please check out the article and read Adrienne's work. It's pretty interesting how you're separating fancy from fact. We just kind of touched on it here. I think we've hit some big points, so it went well.
Yeah, there's lots more. Yeah, and if it's not in the article, it's on the Wikipedia page. And if it's not in either of those two places, I do highly recommend reading Mary Jo Ignofo's biography of Sallie Winchester. It really is the most comprehensive out there, and I think her work is fantastic. So please do look into that if you really want to find out more.
Great. Adrienne Hill, you have been my guest on 502 Conversations. The article is The Truth About Sallie Winchester and the Mystery House That Never Was. It's free to read, and I have linked it below, as I've said.
Oh, and I should give a little shout out to Stephen Hupp, the editor of Skeptical Inquirer. Yes, it is free. Thank you for doing that, my article. But also, if you want to subscribe, I think it was $20, he said, for 6 issues in the year. It's not very expensive, and that unlocks all the backlog of all the different magazines as well.
I have it bookmarked myself.
Yes, me too. Yeah, there's great writers. It's such interesting information. And I've known about the magazine forever, but I never ever thought I would not only be in the magazine, because the very first article I submitted was the Abraham Hicks one, and I didn't know if they'd be interested, and they were very interested. And then this one, to be on the cover, was humbling and a bit surreal, I have to say.
Cover article, that's something.
Yeah, exactly. And my name in big letters. That was really surprising too. Like, who is this person? It's not me.
Adrienne Hill, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
All right, you're welcome. Maybe we can see each other at PsychCon and do something.
I look forward to it.
All righty, great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.